Hello again, everyone, and welcome to SCLC Today TV. I'm your host, Maynard Eaton, and of course, our president and CEO, Dr. Charles Steele Jr. I can really say that Charles Steele Jr. again because it's being echoed all across the country, if not the world, after your two front page articles this week in the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Times. Now, you get international news a lot, but you've really been on the forefront this week because of the Nielsen Settlement. Tell us about that, sir.
Well, thank you, Maynard. And we talked briefly about it last week, but yes, it came out in the paper, two of the papers this week, this past Monday in Chicago, the Chicago Sun-Times and the Chicago Tribune. And they actually came out with the story and interviewed me in terms of none other than Miss Cheryl Gray, or I should say Miss Cheryl Grace. Miss Grace has been involved in negotiation with Nielsen for quite some time now. And the fact being is that this story in its own rights will eliminate some of the animosity that people of color, particularly Black women, this is really dealing with the African-American descent of the female aspect of what Cheryl Grace herself represented. She was dynamic in her own right for 17 years as a senior vice president, ultimately at Nielsen. She didn't start off as a senior vice president, but she worked her way up and dealing with the trust element or factor in terms of the Black community. First of all, Mr. E, African-American Black folks, Negroes of the Negro race for over many of years, not to mention that we've been here in a subjugated or discriminatory, diabolical society in terms of America, but we never trust the government. I mean, you can talk about the Tuskegee experiment all you want to. My grandmama and people in my community that I observed as a young boy was afraid to go around the courthouse. Even in Carrollton, Alabama, they had the experience of hanging a young Black man who was said to be innocent in the jail in Carrollton, Alabama. And guess what? Spiritually, his picture came out in the window pane after they hung him in the jail. This at the City Hall of Carrollton, Alabama, adjacent to the jailhouse. And people used to go by.
Her job was big business. Her job was big business on ratings, and her job was to take statistics, right, of how Nielsen was making their money, correct?
Absolutely. From the fear factor, and what I was talking about in terms of Carrollton, Alabama, with the fear factor of us understanding that this system has always been against people of color, African Americans. And thank God that there have been some fair-minded thinking white folks, Caucasians, and other ethnicity of people. We couldn't have made it without them. People understands that, but I have to say it. There are some good people in terms of society. But there's that element of the Trumpism that brought about many of the things that you're seeing. And I'm getting off of Cheryl Grace right now, going right to the question you're going to ask me next. But in closing with Cheryl is the fact that she is the epitome of a Black woman taking a stand against racism and bringing about the successfulness of this settlement. And thank God for SCLC and the support I've gotten from my chairman, my board, from you and others. We did not relinquish to any degree of the misrepresentation that Nielsen had done and brought upon this young lady. We went directly to the source.
Dr. Steele, unlike many cases you're involved in, she got paid big time, did she not? And will that accrue to some other organizations like ours?
That's a good question. First of all, and the Chicago Sun-Times and the Chicago Tribune asked me that. Tell us about that aspect of the subject. That was not my job. My job was to get her representation of her legal representation to the table with Nielsen. Nielsen had cut off negotiation of talking to me in terms of getting her legal representation as well as herself to the table to bring about a settlement, because she did not want to go back to Nielsen. She wanted to be represented fairly in terms of a settlement, because the N word was used in this company, as well as discriminatory practices of other people of color. And it was totally blatantly racism. So the settlement had been broken off. That's when I was called in by the representation out of Chicago. And my job was to get Nielsen back to the table. And I talked to them several times, from the CEO, the president, and other officers within that company. Board representation from Nielsen as well. But my job was to get the two back to the table, and Nielsen flatly did not respond. So that's when I immediately brought about the Kenyan philosophy of bringing about an educational aspect to the public. You hear about Nielsen, TV rating all over the world, radio rating all over the world. Guess what? They treating this African-American young lady who's been with them for 17 years in a racist mentality of this company and throughout the world, not only in this country.
Finally, I have to say this. This is kind of the opposite of the Black Lives Matters protest, right? I mean, both can work, but you sensing this SCLC philosophy worked in this situation, you're saying?
Absolutely, but it's a package. Of course, Black Lives Matter, other civil rights organizations, we must collaborate. But independently, SCLC is the Marines, in terms of our philosophy. We've been out here for a long time, and there are other organizations, but we've been out here a long time, since 1957, actually 1955 with Rosa Parks, when Dr. King got involved. But this is what I think people don't understand, Mr. Eaton, all over the world. They don't understand civil rights to the point that this is a science. It's just like going to get a study within your academic profession in terms of whatever it may be. This is what God has allowed me to do. I chose this. My commitment and my fulfillment why God created me, and I'm happily to say I discovered my purpose is civil rights. But you have to study what God purpose for your being on this planet called Earth. You have to study the field. That's 24/7. Where does wisdom come from? Wisdom comes from your mistakes. Wisdom comes from your experiences. Wisdom comes from your involvement and institutionalizing the Kenyan philosophy. That's why we're having problems with racism. It's not institutionalized in the schools, in the churches, in corporate America, in society. That's what SCLC brings to the table. The 6 principles of institutionalizing the civil rights movement to treat folks fairly and justly.
It's not just a cause, it's a profession, you're saying. Did you
study? It is a profession. And it's a purpose. It's a science, just like you study in other aspect of academia in terms of professional curriculum. You have to study this. The difference with this, it has to be in the blood and the heart and the mind.
Speaking of blood, sorry to say, 2 mass murders since we last talked, Boulder, Colorado, and in our backyard here, Atlanta, Georgia. Asian hate crime has become the crying word of late. What do you say about that? I mean, there are people of color too. They've been put upon under gunshots, but also since this pandemic flu has come out.
Well, we need some legislation, of course, but legislation does not legislate the heart if you are not committed to mankind and eradicating the diabolical aspect of society. What are you talking about, Steele? There is true understanding within the diabolical aspect of society, which is demonic, the devil. That's a spirit that's running loose. And as Christians and people of faith, we got to deal with this. Just like a fireman. When you're a fireman, Mr. Eaton, and you call upon to go put out a fire, you don't run from the fire. You run to the fire. As civil rights leaders and people of faith and called to your purpose, you must run and bring about a solution to the fact that in America, we are 4% of the world's population. Watch me now. 4% of the world's population, but we possess 45% of the guns. Something is wrong with that. We need a new standard, not only morally, but legislatively in terms of the accessibility of weapons and firearms.
No, I don't know, maybe just my thinking, but there seems to have been a lot of outcry, a lot of outpouring of empathy and sympathy for the Asians that have been shot down and put upon during a pandemic. Some say, I've heard some say, Black folks don't get that kind of endearment. Are we overly sensitive to that, or are Asians getting more heartfelt empathy than perhaps we do many times? Just a thought.
Well,
but I have heard it expressed. I've heard
this, Mr. Eaton, that Black people get shot down even, a weekend in a major city, not just Chicago or New York, here in Atlanta, Memphis, other cities, Birmingham, Alabama. You get people in terms of a violence connotation on a weekly, on a daily basis. And what we must realize is the fact that in the Asian community, people are more reserved than the mixture of races, the mixture of even their own extrovertness in terms of being an extrovert. I tell folks, I'm about to lose my mind in a nonviolent way by Zooming all the time. I'm an extrovert. I'm an extrovert, but it takes something away from me when I'm forced to be an introvert rather than an extrovert. What am I saying? Asian American people are very, very loving folks. I have a lot of friends who are from the Asian community. But what I'm saying is that it's a cultural thing. It's a cultural thing. We are more emotional and more people-oriented in this country than people who consider themselves from another country like China. They feel that they've been left out just as we have. But we are the only ones who come out of a slave background of 400 years of oppression in this country. And this country has never officially given us reparation. That should tell you something there, because they are not sensitive, as Doc Rivers said. For many years, we've loved this country, but this country has not loved us back. So they're not going to have no feeling for us. It's no feeling for us because we never gotten reparation. We never gotten the respect that we deserve, and we built this country. That's why.
That's true. That's true. But speaking of respect, Asians certainly did not get any respect from former President Trump when he called it the China flu, talking about the pandemic. And let me ask you secondarily, have you reached out to any of your Asian friends during this Atlanta onslaught?
Yeah. Of course. Matter of fact, Mr. Eaton, I sent a letter through a couple of friends of mine, one in particular, Dr. Lamb, who's Asian descent, who's a very personal friend, like a brother to me. And we conveyed a letter to the Asian community here in Atlanta, and we're waiting on a response right now because we want to collaborate. And when it's all said and done, Maynard, we all come from one mother, and that mother came from Africa, the motherland. We all came out of Africa. Whatever your ethnicity or racial makeup may be. We are all of one blood, and we all were made and created by God. So that division that we have is a responsibility not only of the faith community, of people in leadership role, of elected officials or politicians. It's up to everyone who want to be purpose-oriented in eradicating the diabolical spirit of the devil, of sinfulness within our society, to stand up and recognize the fact that we are all of one blood. And that's what we are. And that's what I convey.
Dr. Steele, very briefly, we're running late here, but as you well know, you read the papers, voting laws are being attacked or trying to be erased all across the country, particularly in Georgia. But it's a topic of political conversation, how voting rights are being redacted or reinvented almost, retracted, if you will. Maybe that's the right word. But voting rights are...
It is. It's being attacked upon. And again, I hate to be redundant, but repetition is the mother of skill. That's why I keep saying, in a diabolical society, you need SCLC and the civil rights movement now more than ever. You cannot go in fight fire with fire. I'm here to tell you, you got to have some water. And when you lower the flames of the fire, then you have an opportunity to teach. It's a teachable moment. We're dealing with some institutional training and participant type of operation with various corporations and entities of communities, community centers, and throughout in terms of the kingdom philosophy. And we've been saying this for many of years. And many now institutions are calling us and asking us to teach them. Please, my brothers and sisters, teach us, because we realize we have a problem. And what the main problem is with this last previous administration, Mr. Eaton, is that people actually brought about the mindset of this country because we never been healed. You have to be healed from the aspect of the transatlantic African slave trade experience and denigration that we as people of color and Negroes at the time that we went through, and Black people and people of all ethnicity other than the founders of this country. We have never been healed from the transatlantic African slave trade until we recognize every other organization or representation of people other than of the Negroid race. You got the Negroid race, you got the Caucasoid race, you got the Mongoloid race, you got the Australoid race, people from Australia, and you got the Pacific Islanders. Those are the races of people in the world. Everyone has been compensated but African Americans, Black folks.
Do you expect that to ever happen, really? You talk about it a lot. Or is that your prayer, or do you actually expect that to happen? Honestly.
I expect it to happen. I expect it.
Really?
I expect it to happen. You know why? Because there's a God, and I believe in the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. But how can you receive this or expect this if you don't start with demanding it? Do I have to go back to Frederick Douglass?
No.
Power concede nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will.
Finally, on something of a personal note, we witnessed the passing this week of a phenomenal athlete and activist, Elgin Baylor. He used to call him the Big E. I used to love to say that because my last name begins with E, the Big E. And I know you recall him as a fantastic athlete and activist as well, do you not, sir? Elgin Baylor.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When we was coming up, we all wanted to be like Elgin Baylor. That's why it's important to have an imagery in terms of people wanting to be like you. You know, people ask me about, and I'm relating this to Elgin Baylor, not in the context of Dr. King, but Dr. King lived the New Testament within the Bible. You know, he set the example. Elgin Baylor, as an NBA player, outstanding college player, I think from Seattle University. I think, and I know him coming up. I was watching. I said, man, look at that. I used to ball up a piece of paper, put a garbage can over in the corner at the house. and fold up and shoot like I was Elgin Baylor. That's the imagery. Not only that, he stood up for what was right. And don't forget, Mr. E, because of mistreatment, he sued the Los Angeles Clippers and the NBA. He sued them because he felt there was a lot of injustice within himself and other players.
But finally, much like you, he was clean as a board of hell. That brother could look good wearing some clothes, could he not?
That's quite a compliment coming from you, sir. Yeah, you sharp dressing yourself. Well, I was raised in a community that's always emphasized that you need to look like you're going somewhere of significance. I had a good preacher friend of mine, Reverend John Nettles, who always stressed and told me, Reverend Nettles said, when you're dealing with the public, looking the part, representing the part, without even opening your mouth, that's 80% of your closing the deal. And that's from my good friend who's made his transition, the Reverend John Nettles of Anniston, Alabama.
Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a history lesson. This has been a talk with our president, Dr. Charles Steele Jr. This has been SCLC Today TV. I'm Maynard Eaton. We'll see you next week.